Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and we will continue to pick up here with part B of our lecture regarding the modern civil rights movements. Now, we left off, of course, as we transitioned from the African American civil rights movements to the, startings of the Mexican American movement, focusing, of course, on Chavez and Huerta and the UFW. But I want to pick up right here because even at a grassroots level, away from the courts and media attention, Mexicanos would find ways to create a space for themselves through everyday acts of resistance. And I don't mean openly defying laws. I don't mean going out with the mindset, we are activists. No, I mean everyday acts of resistance to what was considered normal, which in and of itself is political engagement. This was often done through community formation and leisure activities. Now, to understand this, we need to discuss what is called the theory of space. Sociologist Henry Lefebvre theorized that space itself is not inherited or found naturally in nature, but rather it is socially and culturally constructed. People create the space in which they live through an intentional process shaped by competing factors such as race, class, experts, among others. And it's this idea that by occupying physical or social spaces in societies, by creating positive public awarenesses, Mexicanos were able to utilize gathering spaces or events to carve out their own place in society, to redefine themselves in the face of being viewed as Anglos as being only temporary migrant low-wage work hands. So how do Mexicanos accomplish this? How do they claim spaces in towns and cities and states? Well, let's start with the physical. Neighborhoods, those barrios, right? Ethnic enclaves. But you realize these spaces don't just include homes, which is important for ownership purposes, but also include businesses that cater not only to Mexicano patrons, but outsiders as well. I mean, where would Texas be without Mexican restaurants? But seriously, look at some of the tangible physical space taken up on these maps. Like this one right here, Detroit, Michigan. This is a nice, large neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan. Yes, Anglos would stigmatize these areas sometimes as rotten spots, as creators of disease outbreak. But you realize this was their space. They were able to mold it and shape it and create it how they wanted to. In fact, if you drive through Detroit, Michigan now on I-75 that runs from Michigan down to Florida, you will see the sign that says Exit 42, Mexican Town. This is their area. And go to any city around Texas or any of the big cities, you know where the Mexican area is. It's a source of pride. It's a source of claiming space, physical space. But even if there was not enough numbers or they weren't allowed to claim an entire neighborhood, they could often just create a central gathering place like a church. Now, some were denoted or built as Mexican churches, such as the one you see in Flint, Michigan, Our Lady of Guadalupe. Flint never had a huge population of Mexicanos. They lived in various neighborhoods, usually based on how close they were to the GM plant they worked at. but Mexicanos could gather together and claim space by the church they built, hold Mexican-themed events, gather together in solidarity, have Spanish language mass. This was their space. Now, other churches were not always built by them, such as the one in Saginaw, Michigan. In Saginaw, Michigan, the community pillar for churches was the St. Joseph Catholic Parish. But residents had to fight to integrate and transform that church into something that they could claim as their own, as being a part of. Members of the church described the First Ward Mexicano community as living in the shadow of St. Joseph Church. And their fight for inclusion therein illustrated how the church became a focal point for the community. See, from 1920s onward, St. Joseph employed a culture of segregation. For example, Mexicano congregants were not even allowed to walk in the center door, considered an honorable place to enter, but rather were forced to enter a side door, a sign of non-inclusion. By the 1940s, Mexicano parishioners worked with the newly arrived Monsignor Harold Bolton to remove those culturally marginalizing markers that had stigmatized Mexicanos for 2 decades. They were now allowed to enter the center door. Anyone could enter any door. They also abolished what was known as pew rental. In other words, there were certain pews of the church that were basically paid for by certain family members of the Anglo community. And therefore, they were their pews. You did not sit in their pews. And so Mexicanos were forced to sit in the back and off to the side. And that ended in the 1940s. In fact, by 1945, more than 300 Mexicano families were members of St. Joseph's. And it was said that they supported the church. They sent their children to school there and participated in the life of the parish, including several organizations. One of which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Those are physical spaces. But what about temporary social spaces? Because while homes and churches were permanent structures, other claims to space were temporary and include things like, well, celebrations. And we talked about this a little bit before with the DACC celebration, how they were important to Mexicanos, often being interpreted as a way to retain Mexican culture. But it was far more than that, especially by the 1940s and 50s and 60s. You see, in the Midwest, the most important holiday was the Dia de Seis. But in places like California, Cinco de Mayo was often more celebrated. Not because of popularity in Mexico, but because it fit better with the migrant harvest season. So in California, migrants had time off in May, whereas September 16th was a very busy time of harvest. They couldn't afford to take time off. It was the flip way in Michigan, in the Midwest, where the harvest season said that in September, there was a lull period where you had time to celebrate and gather and travel for celebrations. But in either case, no matter which the celebration was, the celebration of the Fiestas Patrias caused the area in which they celebrated to become their space, if only for a few days. Let's take a brief look at some of the celebrations in Michigan. Now, by and large, post-World War II events feature some very Mexican-American iconography. Look at the picture here. This is celebrating a Dia de Seis. I'm sorry, this is celebrating a Cinco de Mayo celebration. You have a queen being elected, who's a Mexicana, of course. But look at this picture closely. What do you see? Prominently displayed in this car is both the U.S. and Mexican flags. At a culturally Mexican event, not only does this show respect, but it shows their dual identities. This would help, this practice of having the dual identities foregrounded would help promote the mission of groups like La Unión Cívica Mexicana in Saginaw. This group's stated goal was to promote a culturally rich Mexican heritage, Fiestas Patrias, while helping Mexicans in Saginaw to understand the life, laws, and culture of Americans. In other words, to help Mexicanos navigate both cultural spheres. You see here in this picture, this is just one example. This was done as normal in most all celebrations. Other holiday celebrations include La Novena. One of the highlights of the Saginaw Mexicano community revolved around the celebration of La Novena. The women's group in the church, Las Damas de Guadalupe, would host an annual event in which Las Damas have been doing since 1929. The event begins on December 4th and continues for 9 nights. The holiday commemorates the date of the appearance of Our Lady of Guadalupe to Juan Diego. So again, they celebrate on December 4th, the traditional date given to when the Virgin Mary appeared to Juan Diego in the 1500s. Each night of La Novena, a rosary is prayed and Mass is held, while many Mexicana women dress in more traditional Mexican cultural apparel. The event culminates on December 12th, the day celebrated when La Virgen will appear to Juan Diego. Las Damas en La Novena have become fixtures of St. Joseph Catholic Church in Saginaw, Michigan. It inspired parishioners who united around the Mexicano communities. Like the 16, this culturally Mexican Catholic celebration afforded a space of dialogue and camaraderie from both the local and surrounding Mexicano communities on the shared devotion of La Virgen, but also it basically allowed the Mexicano community to take over the predominantly Anglo church for at least these 12 nights a year. I'm sorry, 8 nights a year. And so that discrimination that existed from the 1920s to 1940s caused the first novenas to be held in the homes of the devout. But by the early 40s, they were able to hold La Novena as well as hang a picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe in the parish itself. The push to hold this event at the church became essential for acceptance as equals. For Saginaw's St. Joseph Mexicano parishioners, La Novena, prior to the 1970s, represented the number one time each year when they were able to move to the foreground of church social space. For those days in December, Mexicanos from St. Joseph and surrounding parishes were able to physically occupy the building through their congregating together to claim social space by heralding a distinctly culturally Mexican holiday in the Spanish language, often dressed in what members of Las Damas describe as traditional Mexican apparel. And the thing is, these events all start out small, right? They all start out small and they grow over the years. And the organizers would use these celebrations, whether it's the 16 or Cinco de Mayo or La Novena, to draw attention to local problems, which would include writing to local congressmen, leading to more direct political activism for the communities at large. Moreover, this increased influence extended far beyond just the organizers and leaders of the event. Participants, though most were not seeking to make a clear delineation between pleasure-seeking and political activism, it was very much a part of the process. They were very much a part of the process of pushing for civic and political inclusion, for pushing out of their prescribed, often segregated boundaries and into social acceptance, into the public sphere. The sheer number of Mexicanos in attendance not only created a strength in number, to the perceived success of the events, but the increased expansion to new, more, and larger venues. Remember, if you have more and more people sign up and participate in each year in these events, you need bigger stadiums. You need bigger arenas. You need more facilities. So the sheer number of Mexicanos in attendance for the Fiestas Patrias prompted organizers to not only ask for more public space, but also for local Anglo political leaders to oblige the request. They begin not just giving out a small hall or opera house. No, they are now renting stadiums, convention centers, fairgrounds to hold these events. This physically enlarged the Mexicano occupation of space, even if only temporarily. Thus, all participants played a part in claiming their first-class citizenship rights of assembly in public spaces, often denied them as a segregated people living in a racialized environment. But it wasn't just celebrations. Sports would also offer some modicum of social acceptance and positive portrayal of Mexicanos in the face of racist stereotypes. Take baseball, for instance. Strongly perceived as a traditional American sport, the national pastime, baseball has had a long history in Mexico and other Latin American countries, representing an archetypal American cultural export. As early as the 1870s, U.S. businessmen began making direct investments into Mexico as a way to expand their business operations during this period of American imperialism. American cultural forms, including baseball, closely follow the investment of capital south of the border. For Americans, teaching baseball to their Mexican employees was an attempt to civilize them with so-called wholesome leisure activities, converting Mexicans from the more barbaric pursuits of bullfighting and cockfighting. Reformers thought that prowess and participation on the diamond, baseball diamond, would help shape potential immigrants into proper U.S. citizens by installing a strong work ethic and a focus on the greater good, teamwork. They also agreed with this as a strategy for paternalistic benefits in hoping of controlling their low-paid, overworked labor force to stave off unionization. This is all true. But the baseball diamond would evolve into more than an athletic arena. It became a cultural battleground for discourses about citizenship, respectability, and racial equality. Mexicanos and other Latinos did not enter the U.S. Baseball League simply as black or white. Rather, they occupied a position between the poles of white and inclusion and black of exclusion. This was first manifested in the racialization of one Vincent Nava. He was characterized as a Spaniard, as a Spanish catcher in the early 1880s. You see, a few minor league baseball teams signed ambiguously white ethnics, or in rare instances, light-skinned African Americans. Still, other teams would hire mascots or other featured curiosities to draw in fans. So it was in this vein that the Providence Board agreed to sign Nava, not as a challenge to the white-black color line, but as an exotic drawing card that you must come and behold. And so you have a first Latino or Hispanic in Major League Baseball. Now, following the Spanish-American War, Cubans were seen as more welcomed, more accepted as baseball players. Because, hey, they were our allies in this fight against the Spanish, right? And we took them over for a short time. And so these Latino players, and mostly often Cuban, Puerto Rican, became a bridge between the white and the eventual inclusion of black ball players. Latinos who broke into the major leagues were not necessarily accepted as racial equals. Their entry required manipulating the finer points of national origin, ethnicity, and skin color that distinguished racially eligible from racially ineligible. Not all players were allowed to participate in the majors. Many were racialized as white. Many were racialized as non-white. Nor did major league organizations sign them because they were presented as such. Rather, what they did was insist that these ball players were just not black. So baseball teams want to win. That's their goal. And they saw these Latino ball players saying, yeah, we're not supposed to really sign them because they're not white, but they're also not black. So not that they accepted them, not that they welcomed them as equals, but they weren't black. Remember, this while it was not a legally constructed theory at the time, this is that idea that they are legally white, but second-class citizens, a class apart theory, they're not black at least. And just because some were allowed to enter the big leagues, it does not erase racism. Take Boston Red Sox great Ted Williams. I bet you didn't know this, but Ted Williams is Hispanic. He's a Mexicano. You never would know this. Ted Williams made the decision to publicly not acknowledge his Mexican heritage. His mother was of Mexican descent. He never mentioned it during his career as a ball player or a manager. And that matters in a historical sense. His choice attests to the dominant ideas of race that affected people from Spanish-speaking Americas on the professional U.S. baseball diamonds, and of course, the United States more generally. Williams indicates awareness of these issues in his autobiography called My Turn at Bat. And when he declares that his professional baseball career would have taken a very different trajectory had others known he had Mexican ancestry. Ultimately, though, it was largely the Caribbean acceptance at the major league level, with at least 53 players of Latino descent before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. But realize, of those 53, 39 were Cubans. Just 3 were Mexicano. And again, we're not counting Ted Williams in that. But really, this was not just the major league level here, because at the major league level, things are a little dicey up there. Non-acceptance. Not being accepted at all, not being seen as a positive thing. But at the local level, throughout the United States, many Mexican leagues formed. And the games themselves would provide a space for spatial inclusion. Even for Latinas, games played at Central Park and elsewhere in the city would provide a chance to create a distinctly Latino space. The foods they brought to the game, reflecting the traditional fares from Latin America, gave the setting a particular flavor. But they performed more than just traditional gender roles of cooking food. Some women would collect bets. Others would be umpires. The local games would also be picked up and reported on in local newspapers. And guys, I have read these newspapers. I've read a number of them. And what you find is in the newspapers in the 1950s, you see a lot about braceros. Again, negative image of Mexicans as being farm workers only. You see a lot about Operation Wetback in the 50s. Big surprise there. You see a lot about health outbreaks, disease outbreaks. Negative. All negative stuff. The one place that I have found in my research was the sports page. Again, not the major league level. That was usually left out. But in the local sports news, they often would have articles. You see on the screen there, the Mexican 9 to play Twin Bill on Sunday. The Adrian Mexican 9 whips Toledo 13-7. The Panthers topple the Caballeros. And on the map on the bottom right of your screen, these are just the confirmed Michigan Mexicano baseball teams that I was able to document between 1940 and 1970. You see, the newspapers would talk about prowess on the baseball field. They would also talk about prowess in high school sports, such as basketball and football. And they often, many times, wouldn't even necessarily say it was Mexican by the last name of Chavez who performed. No, it was just running back in a Hispanic name, had 2 touchdowns, or scored 22 points to help lead their team to victory. Or in this case, these Mexican baseball teams. It was the one place in the newspaper where it was not about being disease carrying, spreading disease in the communities, living in squalor, being a blight on the city, being a migrant farm worker only, being an undocumented immigrant. None of that stuff was there. It was just they are participating as normal members of U.S. society. That's it. And the same went for boxing also. For instance, you see the man on the right, Guadalupe Ortega. Prior to being drafted, Army veteran Lupe Ortega was a regular participant in boxing. Backroom, everyday, fisticuffs. Fondly recalling the place saying, someone brought gloves, we did a lot of boxing. Ortega stated he was not trying to be macho, but rather he wanted to learn self-defense, a skill that would serve him well in the Army, where he boxed for recreation against white boxers, or when he felt personally attacked by Anglo soldiers. This earned him respect, and, in his words, earned him some acceptance by his white comrades. Again, we could spend a lot more time here. In fact, my dissertation I wrote does this. But I do want to revisit this a little bit later when we get to the Chicano movement. So until then, take care, and bye-bye.